if you are ready to continue our conversation on the story of civilization and to take on the next book that deals with essentially the Enlightenment, then today's book just might be for you. Today we will be covering The Age of Louis XIV by Will and Ariel Durant. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking a look at the 8th book in the Story of Civilization series, this one right here, and what is essentially the second book in what is a 4-book series on the Age of Enlightenment. If you know anything about Will and Ariel Durant and you know their background in philosophy, you would know why they would put such a big focus on this time period, particularly with the interest in the Enlightenment. That is clearly the thing that drove the last several books of this series. I would really say from here on out to the end of the series, except for maybe the Age of Napoleon, you could lump them all together as all part of the exploration of the Enlightenment. Even the Age of Napoleon, I'd say you could still say there's part of it, at least in terms of spreading Enlightenment ideas. As usual, let me give you the full name of the book. It is The Story of Civilization, Volume 8, The Age of Louis XIV, Will and Ariel Durant. A History of European Civilization in the Period of Pascal, Molière, Cromwell, Milton, Peter the Great, Newton, and Spinoza. So that should give you an idea of generally what we're going to cover. And as you can tell by the name of the book, there is going to be a huge focus on the French monarchy, hence the name Louis XIV, but also how that is in many ways the zenith of French influence on culture. This is the moment of the absolutist king with Louis XIV, the great endeavors on not just building up the great architecture that he is known for and the centralization of the French state, which he was responsible for, but also the fact that he is going to be a big promoter of the arts and literature, and that is going to help promote much of the Enlightenment. The book before this, we dealt much more with the beginning of that, really more dealing with the scientific revolution, and this one is building upon that, and this is taking us into the next phase where we're taking the scientific revolution, where there's this new focus on these methods of reasoning, reductive and deductive reasoning, and creating an approach to how we can take stuff on scientifically, and now this is essentially the next wave of that. So now we're getting to people more like Newton, where we're taking that and we are not just doing scientific experiments, but we are now creating a much broader conversation about what this can tell us about the nature of humanity and what it can tell us about the nature of government and what it can tell us about how exactly we should be engaging with the world around us. Of course, one of the most fascinating aspects of this book, and really all of the books in the latter half of this series, I would say, is about how the Durants chose to structure it. So just looking at the table of contents, it can help reveal what exactly the focus was, and on this broad spectrum of European civilization, especially during the time frame that they chose of over just 67 years, I think is the time constraints that they give. So the book begins with an extensive overview of the political landscape of Europe after the 30 Years' War. That was the thing that ended the book before this. And it talks about, just the balance of power and the way that it shifted with the rise of France. Don't forget that in the 30 Years' War, it was predominantly a Protestant versus Catholic conflict, but France tended to side with the Protestants because it helped to empower them politically and militarily, and to help stamp down the growing influence of the Habsburgs, both in the Holy Roman Empire and in Spain. And so one of the products of that is that, of course, France is going to be at its height after the 30 Years' War, or soon after that, I should say. It does take some rebuilding. And so that's going to be the thing that really contributes to creating this French Golden Age. Of course, they don't limit themselves to French history. I mean, they really do also devote significant attention to the intellectual movements that are emerging across Europe. I mean, there's a full chapter on how the Age of Reason begins, referring back to the book before this, where we're seeing discussion of Spinoza, Leibniz, and Newton. Newton plays a pretty big role in this. He gets his own chapter, and of course, those are there to help set the groundwork for what would often be viewed as the birth of modern science, and again picking up the growing bits of the scientific revolution, and then also developing that furthermore into this age of philosophy, and just providing a broader understanding of how ideas flowed across the national borders during this time. So after he covers France, he then spends a great deal of time on England, and then he then looks at other parts of Europe, although not in nearly as much detail as you saw with his focus on France and England. And then finally, the last section, which I find probably the most interesting, is he calls it France against Europe. And in other words, this is this moment of French cultural superiority, but also a real shift in powers in Europe. And I'm sure we'll see how that plays out in the coming books. Of course, the early mid 18th century is where we really start to see the rise of English influence well beyond what we had seen in any century before that. So as usual, I would have to say that for a Will and Ariel Durant book, this is very well done in terms of being easy to read, and I think that their structure is very deliberate, and I think that's very helpful. And it's worth pointing out that this is a period in time where, especially if you're trying to explore European history, where you just have so much going on in so many different places, that I find it fascinating that he chose to write a book called The Age of Louis XIV. And obviously he focuses the French culture at this time, but that's also just a really important choice because you have so much else going on all throughout Europe at this time. And I would argue that they all have some importance, and you could credibly focus any book on them if you wanted to, which he does not choose to do. He very much is going to stay focused on France. And I think that continues really in many ways for the rest of the series. I mean, looking at the rest of the books, you have the Age of Voltaire, you have Rousseau and Revolution, or yeah, you have the Age of Voltaire, Rousseau and Revolution, and then the Age of Napoleon. So you can see how France is the central focus of all of that. So this book, I think, really contributes to the structure for the rest of the series, and not just a decision to focus in on France at this one point, but you can see how this idea of the Enlightenment being essentially the conclusion of the Age of the Story of Civilization series is going to be very much focused on how France leads that. And that is a narrative that he chooses. And I think that he, at least up to this point, I think he does a good job at explaining it, although, like I said, I feel like you could also pretty easily argue against that. So who would I say this is for? Well, it is a great exploration of France at its zenith. So if you have not read the other books in this series, but you're just wondering if this is one that would interest you, and you're a big fan of Louis XIV and just that age of pomp, that age of state building, then this, I think, is a pretty good book for that. Similar to the book before this, there are going to be issues of fully appreciating the entirety of the book. You might want to only read parts of it unless you're reading all the way through like I am, in which case, you know, I think it's a great read, and I don't think you'll struggle with this book in any case. But I do think that unlike some of the other books earlier in the series, it might be hard to want to read this whole book in and of itself. You are more likely to want to read pieces of it, just because of the way he has to jump around Europe a little bit to tell the story that he's trying to tell. But you know, I think that you could still very much enjoy it. That's who I think this is for. It is long, so that is always a caveat with these books, but I do think that they are quite well written. So that's who I think it's for. Who do I not think it's for? Well, if for any reason this is not going to appeal to you, whether it's the time period, the length of it, or you have read anything else by Will Durant and you just don't think that it's all that interesting, then it's not going to be for you. But otherwise, I do think they're generally well-written histories, and I certainly think that there is a room for lots of people to enjoy them, even if they don't consider themselves history buffs, or if they don't think that this is the type of book they would normally be drawn to. I do think you could still enjoy it. But obviously, it's a very long book, so that may be the biggest deterrent of all to anyone. But as a whole, I recommend it. Of course, let me know what you think about this book in particular, if you have other thoughts about the rest of the Story of Civilization, or about Will Durant, or anything about this series, or anything like it. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.